that Howard Gardner,
Yes.
who identified at least seven different types of intelligence.
Yes, he did.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this idea of EQ overlaps quite a bit with Gardner's social intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, the question is, what's the relation between emotional intelligence, you know, the sort of ways I've been talking about it, and Howard Gardner's list of 7 different kinds of intelligence. So he has, for instance, you know, conventional IQ, he has mathematical intelligence, he has spatial intelligence, he has proprioceptive intelligence, people who are dancers are terribly good at moving in a certain kind of way and so on. So one of those kinds of intelligence is what he calls social intelligence. And there is an overlap between EQ and social intelligence.
But it just seemed to me that Gardner's work was much more, much broader and
it is.
More potentially useful in a way.
I'm thinking about that.
Uh-huh.
Well, certainly educators love Howard Gardner. You know, because if you are a teacher in a high school, you're faced with a whole bunch of kids, and in a kind of way what you want to do is to be able to talk to their abilities rather than, if I may put it this way, to their disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so they like the Gardner idea because you can identify people's strengths and then build on them. Now, the way Gardner works, I mean, he used to be a regular cognitive psychologist like me. I mean, I know him somewhat. What happened is that he got this idea that you are talking about, but the data from that are really studying people's biographies. So what he does is he, you know, studies the biography of Gandhi. He studies the biography of Mozart. He studies the biography of Norma Graham and so on, and then looks to see whether there are common elements that he can take out from these biographies and then inject them into this idea of people being particularly good at one thing. So this EQ thing, you see, is they're really doing a totally different kind of thing than Gardner is.
Didn't Gardner develop tests for some of these abilities?
I didn't know that he did, but he may have done. He may have done. I mean, the books that I don't.
It's been a long time since I read them.
No. I mean, he continues to produce books which are these, you know, biography-driven books. But it's possible. I don't know. I'm sorry.
I'm going to invite other questioners to please come to the microphone so we have this on record. And please, if you could limit it to one question only until everybody's had a chance to ask questions.
Okay. So you have 4 components of EQ. I'm wondering if you have data on correlation among them, and is there data on correlation between EQ and IQ?
Yes. Well, I think that's absolutely the kind of research that all of these people working in this area are trying to do. So what a really good test will do is to produce questions that do have a high correlation among themselves. And then they will, if that's true, they can then say, yes, well, this test does measure a single underlying thing. And so the people who are constructing EQ tests, or indeed tests of any kind, absolutely look at that. The other thing that you want to do, though, and that's what the Mayer and Salovey gang want to do, is to say, all right, now within any one of these branches there are correlations, but we want to argue that these are separate, and so we want no correlation between the branches. So they want correlation within any of these branches, but they want orthogonality between one branch and another. And this is work that is still ongoing, and the, you know, what I call the EQ police, Zeidner, Roberts and Matthews, are constantly pointing out that all this work hasn't really been done properly yet for these several measures. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Presumably,
when you hire someone in your department at the university, do you submit them to a IQ and EQ test? And secondly, to what degree do you rely on the results?
Well, let me put it like this. My daughter wants to be a doctor, and she's just taken an IQ test called the MCAT. Right? So this is a test used in the United States to admit people to medical school, and it's a generic test which includes, reasoning, being able to write an essay, plus, how much do you know about physics, how much do you know about cell biology, how much. So it's both content specific and content general, and the idea is in America that if you want to be a doctor, then you have to score very high on this test. So that's a kind of IQ test. If, on the other hand, you want to train as a doctor at McMaster, then they're actually a bit more interested in who you are and what you're up to in your life. Now, as far as I know, they don't do an EQ test, but if there were such a thing, I can imagine they'd be interested. I don't think there's nobody I know who would, there are studies looking to see whether EQ does predict anything, but it's really still very much in the development stage.
But do you...
Me, certainly not. No, I wouldn't even think.
What about the IQ test itself? Would you rely on it, or do you
well,
sort of...
people's grades as I worked in a place which was mainly graduate students, and we looked at people's grades, which is a measure of IQ. Now, it's not the only thing, no. But it look, we're making jokes about coming from England. When I was 11, they introduced an IQ test, an absolutely standard IQ test, to determine whether the 11-year-old kid, it was called the 11 plus, and depending on how well you did on this, you could either go to high school or a school called secondary modern, meaning nobody was going to pay any attention to you. Right? So here, once again, the psychologists have managed to sell to the politicians an IQ test for the purposes of selection. So I'm myself, I don't much like the idea of one bunch of people making decisions on behalf of another bunch of people on the basis of evidence that is, not as good as it might be. And I think that's, as I say, the real use of IQ is helping kids who are not doing very well at school. It does predict things like educational success. It does predict things like salary and so on. And many employers do indeed use versions of personality tests and IQ tests for selection. I myself, selecting people into our department, that haven't done that.
You would probably interview them personally for...
Well, it turns out interviews are hopeless as well, you see. What you get from an interview is pretty much, do you like this person? And the predictive results of that are very poor. The only interview question that really works is, have you done this job before?
Yeah.
How did you do in this job when this, and this happened? All right? But for things, for instance, like the difference between, being at school and going to university, there's really quite a large change. And there is some predictiveness, but it's not as high as it might be. Now, the difficulty, of course, and the thing that these testing people are doing, which is good, is instead of admitting people to educational institutions on the basis of their family or the amount of money they had, it sort of does open it up for everybody, and that's obviously good. But at the same time, it has its own problems to it, you see. So it's not. It seems to me it's not a straightforward issue. And EQ is even less straightforward because these tests, in the way that you're saying, haven't really been properly developed in a way that everybody says, oh yes, now this is really working.